I bought an old auction car with my pension money. The first thing I noticed was a built-in GPS with one address saved as home. Out of curiosity, I decided to go there. The road took me down dirt paths for 3 hours, no towns in sight, until I reached an abandoned billionaire's mansion. But when I opened the door, I found something that changed my life forever. I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. I never thought I'd be the kind of man who made reckless decisions at 67. For 4 decades, I'd been the responsible one, the provider, the man who calculated every expense down to the penny. But standing in that dusty auction lot on a humid Tuesday morning in July, staring at a 1978 Cadillac Eldorado with more rust than shine, something inside me snapped. My name is Marvin, and 3 years ago my world fell apart when Margaret died. The woman who'd been my anchor for 42 years was gone, leaving behind an empty house and children who seemed to view me as nothing more than an inconvenience with a monthly pension check. The auction house buzzed with activity. Dealers shuffled around examining engines and checking VIN numbers, while I stood there feeling completely out of place. I'd driven my practical Honda Civic to the lot, the same car Margaret and I had bought together 5 years before she passed. It was reliable, economical, everything a retired factory worker should want. But looking at it parked between a sleek BMW and a vintage Mustang, it felt like a monument to all the dreams I'd never pursued. The auctioneer's voice boomed across the lot. Next up, Lot 47, 1978 Cadillac Eldorado. Needs some work, but she's got character, folks. I found myself walking toward the car almost without thinking. The burgundy paint was faded and chipped, the chrome bumper spotted with age, but something about it called to me. Maybe it was the way the morning sun caught the curve of the hood, or maybe it was just the fact that it represented everything I'd never allowed myself to have. "What's the starting bid?" I heard myself asking. The auctioneer looked surprised. Most of the serious bidders had moved on to the newer vehicles. "Starting at $800, sir. $800. That was almost a quarter of my monthly pension, money I couldn't really afford to spend. My son David had been after me for months to move into a smaller apartment, to stop wasting money on the house Margaret and I had shared. My daughter Lisa called once a month, usually when her credit card bills were due, always with some sob story about unexpected expenses. "800, I said, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. A dealer in the back raised his hand. "900. I should have walked away. I should have gone home to my empty house and microwaved another frozen dinner while watching reruns of shows Margaret and I used to enjoy together. But instead, I raised my hand. 1,000. The dealer shook his head and moved on. The auctioneer looked around the sparse crowd. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the blue shirt for $1,000. My hands were shaking as I signed the paperwork. Mrs. Henderson from the auction office looked at me with concern. "You sure about this, honey? This car's been sitting here for 3 months. Previous owner died, and the family just wanted it gone." Something about those words hit me harder than they should have. Another old man, gone and forgotten, his possessions scattered to strangers. Is that what would happen to me? Would David and Lisa just cart off my belongings to the nearest auction house when my time came? "I'm sure," I told her, though I wasn't sure of anything anymore. The keys felt heavy in my palm as I walked toward my purchase. The interior smelled like old leather and pine air freshener, with an underlying mustiness that spoke of years of neglect. The engine turned over on the 3rd try, coughing to life with a rumble that vibrated through the worn seat. As I was adjusting the rearview mirror, I noticed something I hadn't seen during the brief inspection. A GPS unit was mounted on the dashboard, an older model but still functional. The screen flickered to life as the engine warmed up, and I saw there was one saved destination in the memory. Home. I stared at the address for a long moment. It wasn't anywhere I recognized, not even in the same state. The location showed somewhere deep in rural Virginia, hours away from my suburban Maryland neighborhood. Curiosity got the better of me, and I pressed the details button. The GPS estimated a 3-hour and 20-minute drive through increasingly remote country roads. Whose home was this? The previous owner, the man who'd died and left this car to be auctioned off like an afterthought? I thought about Mrs. Henderson's words about the family just wanting it gone. Maybe this address held answers about the man who'd owned this car before me, the man whose final possessions had been scattered to the wind just like mine would be someday. I pulled out of the auction lot, the Cadillac's engine settling into a steady rhythm. At the first red light, I found myself staring at that GPS screen again. Home. Such a simple word, but it carried so much weight. I hadn't felt like I had a real home since Margaret died. The house where we'd raised our children, where we'd celebrated birthdays and anniversaries, where we'd planned for a retirement we'd never get to share together, felt more like a museum now than a home. The light turned green, and I faced a choice. I could turn right and head back to my empty house, back to my routine of morning coffee alone and evening news watched in silence. Or I could turn left toward the highway, toward whatever home meant in the GPS of a dead stranger. For the first time in 3 years, I chose the unknown. I turned left. As I merged onto Interstate 66, heading west into the Virginia countryside, I felt something I hadn't experienced since before Margaret got sick. Not happiness exactly, but something close to it. Purpose, maybe. Or just the simple thrill of not knowing what came next. The Cadillac ate up the miles with surprising smoothness, its big V8 engine humming contentedly as we left the suburbs behind. I'd forgotten what it felt like to drive something with real power, something that didn't calculate gas mileage or worry about practical concerns. This car was built for a different time, when driving was about more than just getting from point A to point B. But even as the road opened up before me and the first hints of excitement flickered in my chest, I couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Henderson's sad smile when she'd mentioned the previous owner, another forgotten man whose family couldn't wait to dispose of his belongings. Was I driving toward answers about him, or was I just running away from the inevitable truth about my own future? 3 hours into the drive, I began to understand what true isolation felt like. The interstate had given way to state highways, which had surrendered to county roads, and now I found myself on what could barely be called a road at all. The GPS kept insisting I was on the right path, but the cracked asphalt beneath the Cadillac's wheels told a different story. Cell phone service had disappeared somewhere around the 2-hour mark. The last gas station I'd seen was 40 minutes behind me, a run-down place with 2 pumps and a handwritten sign advertising live bait. I'd almost stopped there, almost turned around and headed back to the familiar disappointment of my routine life. But something about the way the afternoon sun slanted through the windshield, the way the old car seemed to know exactly where it was going, kept me moving forward. The landscape had changed dramatically since leaving the main highway. Rolling hills covered in thick forest stretched as far as I could see, broken only by the occasional weathered barn or abandoned farmhouse. There were no billboards here, no chain restaurants or strip malls. It felt like driving back in time to an America that existed before progress paved over everything beautiful and wild. I thought about Margaret as I drove. She would have loved this adventure, this spontaneous journey into the unknown. During our 42 years together, I'd been the practical one, always worried about schedules and budgets and 5-year plans. She'd been the dreamer, the one who wanted to take weekend trips to places she'd seen in magazines, who'd collect brochures for bed and breakfast we never visited because I was always saving for tomorrow. Tomorrow. What a joke that had turned out to be. All those tomorrows I'd planned for, and she wasn't here to see any of them. The GPS announced that I was approaching my destination, though I couldn't see any signs of civilization anywhere. The road had narrowed to barely 1 lane, with overgrown branches scraping against the car's sides. Gravel crunched under the tires as we climbed a gentle hill, and then suddenly, the trees parted like a curtain being drawn back. I had to slam on the brakes. Before me stood the most magnificent house I'd ever seen outside of a movie. It wasn't just large, it was majestic, a 3-story Victorian mansion with wraparound porches, intricate gingerbread trim, and a tower that reached toward the sky like something from a fairy tale. The late afternoon sun painted the cream-colored siding in shades of gold and amber, making the whole structure seem to glow from within. But it was clearly abandoned. Weeds choked the circular driveway, and several shutters hung at odd angles. The wraparound porch sagged in places, and I could see missing shingles on the complex roofline. Yet even in its neglected state, the house radiated a dignity that took my breath away. I sat in the idling Cadillac for several minutes, just staring. The GPS screen cheerfully announced, "You have arrived at your destination. Home." Home. Whose home had this been? What kind of man had lived in a place like this, only to end up dying alone with his possessions scattered to auction houses? Finally, I turned off the engine and stepped out of the car. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wind through the massive oak trees that surrounded the property. No traffic noise, no neighbors, No sounds of modern life at all. Just peace, deeper and more complete than any I'd known since Margaret's last days in the hospital. I walked slowly toward the front porch, my footsteps loud on the gravel drive. The front door was massive, carved oak with stained glass panels that caught and scattered the afternoon light. Above it, brass letters spelled out Blackwood Manor. A brass plaque beside the door read, Est 1893. This house was older than my grandfather would have been. It had witnessed more than a century of seasons, of families, of lives lived and lost, and now it sat empty, waiting for something or someone that might never come. I tried the front door, not really expecting it to open, but the handle turned easily in my hand. The door swung inward with a soft creak that seemed to echo through the interior like a whisper of welcome. The foyer took my breath away. A grand staircase curved upward to the second floor, its mahogany banister gleaming despite the dust that coated everything else. Tall windows let in streams of golden light that illuminated moats dancing in the air like tiny spirits. To my left, I could see into what must have been a library, its walls lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound books. To my right, a formal parlor with furniture covered in white sheets, like ghosts of a more elegant time. Every instinct I'd developed over 67 years of practical living told me to leave. This wasn't my house, wasn't my business. I was trespassing, intruding on someone else's private grief, but my feet carried me forward anyway, drawn by a curiosity I hadn't felt in years. The rooms I passed through told the story of a life well lived but ultimately solitary. There were no family photographs on the mantels, no signs that children had ever run through these halls. Instead, I found evidence of refined tastes and quiet passions, a music room with a grand piano covered in sheet music, a study lined with maps and travel books, a conservatory where exotic plants had long since withered in their ornate pots. In what must have been the master bedroom, I found a framed photograph on the nightstand. It showed a distinguished man with silver hair and kind eyes, standing beside the very car I'd just driven here. He was smiling, one hand resting on the Cadillac's hood, and for a moment I felt like I was looking at a ghost. Henry Blackwood, according to the nameplate on the desk downstairs. Born 1945, which would have made him just 2 years older than me. He'd lived here alone, in this beautiful, enormous house, with only his car for company on those long drives down mountain roads that led nowhere. How had his story ended? Had he died in this house, in this very room? Had anyone found him? Or had he lain here for days before someone thought to check on the old hermit in the mansion on the mountain? I found myself sitting on the edge of his bed, holding that photograph and feeling a kinship with this stranger that defied explanation. 2 old men, both alone, both forgotten by the world they'd helped build with their youth and strength. The only difference was that Henry Blackwood had found this place, this sanctuary where he could live and die with dignity intact. The sun was getting lower, painting the room in shades of orange and red. I should go, I told myself. I should get back in that Cadillac and drive home to my empty house, my frozen dinners, my children who called only when they needed money. But something about this place, about the peace that seemed to emanate from its very walls, made me reluctant to leave. I was still sitting there, lost in thoughts of roads not taken and dreams deferred, when I heard footsteps on the gravel drive outside. My heart jumped into my throat as I realized I'd been caught trespassing in a dead man's home. But as I looked out the window, what I saw made me freeze with an entirely different kind of shock. A young man was walking toward the house, and in his hand, he carried a set of keys that looked exactly like the ones in my pocket. I froze at the bedroom window, watching the young man approach the house with those familiar keys. My mind raced through possibilities, none of them good. Was he family? A caretaker? Someone with more right to be here than an old fool who'd followed a GPS into a stranger's life? The footsteps stopped at the front door, and I heard the sound of keys jingling. Then, unexpectedly, a voice called out, warm and unthreatening. "Hello? I saw the car in the driveway. My name is Daniel Blackwood." Blackwood, the same name as the man in the photograph I still held in my trembling hands. I made my way downstairs, slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I reached the foyer, I found a man in his mid-30s standing just inside the doorway. He had the same kind eyes as the man in the photograph, the same strong jawline, but where Henry Blackwood had carried himself with the quiet dignity of age, this young man radiated a gentle strength that immediately put me at ease. "I'm sorry," I began, my voice catching slightly. I didn't mean to intrude. I bought a car at an auction, and there was this address in the GPS. Daniel raised a hand, a slight smile crossing his face. You must be the one who bought my father's Cadillac. Father. The word hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just some random stranger. This was Henry Blackwood's son, standing in his father's house, looking at the old man who'd driven here in his father's car like some kind of automotive ghost. I can explain, I said quickly. I'm Marvin Richardson. I bought the car this morning at an auction in Maryland. I found the address and I was curious, so I trailed off, realizing how ridiculous it all sounded. But Daniel's expression remained kind, understanding even. Dad died 6 months ago, he said quietly. Heart attack, right here in this house. He was 72, lived alone for the past 15 years since Mom passed. The photograph in my hand suddenly felt impossibly heavy. I'm so sorry for your loss, and I'm sorry for being here. I should go. No, Daniel said quickly. Please don't. I'd like to talk to you, if you have time. Something in his voice, a loneliness that echoed my own, made me nod. We moved into the library, where Daniel pulled dust covers off 2 leather armchairs positioned near a massive stone fireplace. The late afternoon light streaming through tall windows illuminated thousands of books, their leather spines creating a tapestry of knowledge accumulated over decades. Dad loved this room, Daniel said, settling into one of the chairs. He spent most of his time here after Mom died, reading, writing in his journals, planning trips he never took. I looked around at the collection, recognizing the signs of a deeply cultured man. First editions of classic literature sat alongside travel guides for countries I'd never even dreamed of visiting. Art books filled one entire section, their pages marked with bookmarks and handwritten notes. He was a collector, I observed. More than that, Daniel said. He was a dreamer who forgot how to dream. After Mom died, he retreated into this house and rarely left except to drive that Cadillac on long trips to nowhere. He'd be gone for days sometimes, just driving. As Daniel spoke, I found myself walking along the bookshelves, marveling at the scope of Henry Blackwood's interests. There were books on architecture, history, philosophy, astronomy. This wasn't the library of a man who'd simply collected books for show. These volumes were worn from reading, filled with bookmarks and marginal notes that spoke of an active, engaged mind. Did he have other children? I asked, though something told me I already knew the answer. Daniel's face darkened slightly. 2 older sisters. They live in California now. Haven't been back here since Mom's funeral. When Dad died, they wanted nothing to do with this place. Said it was too remote, too much trouble. They were happy to let everything go to auction. The bitterness in his voice was unmistakable, and I felt a sharp pang of recognition. How many children saw their parents as burdens rather than blessings? How many families fell apart when the work of caring became inconvenient? But you stayed, I said. I bought a small house about 2 miles down the mountain road. I've been taking care of this place since Dad died, making sure it doesn't fall apart completely while I figure out what to do with it. He gestured around the room. Dad left it to me in his will, but honestly, I don't know what I'm supposed to do with a 15-room mansion in the middle of nowhere. I continued my exploration of the library, drawn to a section that seemed dedicated to automotive history. Here were books about classic cars, restoration guides, and photo albums filled with pictures of the Cadillac in its prime. In one album I found dozens of photographs of Henry Blackwood with his car, taken at various scenic locations across the country. He'd driven that Cadillac everywhere, to national parks, historic sites, small towns that probably hadn't seen many visitors in decades. He really loved that car, I murmured, studying a photograph of Henry standing beside the pristine Cadillac at what looked like the Grand Canyon. It was more than love, Daniel said, coming to stand beside me. After Mom died, that car became his lifeline to the world. He'd plan these elaborate road trips, research every stop, prepare for weeks. Then he'd drive for days, taking pictures, collecting memories. It was the only thing that seemed to bring him any joy. I closed the album gently, feeling like I was intruding on something sacred. I had no idea. When I bought it, I thought it was just an old car that needed work. Dad would have liked that, Daniel said with a sad smile. He always said the car would find its way to someone who needed it. He had this theory that cars develop personalities, that they choose their owners as much as owners choose them. We moved into the music room, where a magnificent Steinway grand piano dominated the space. Sheet music covered the top, pieces by Chopin and Debussy marked with penciled notations in Henry's careful handwriting. I tried a few keys and was surprised to find the instrument still perfectly tuned. He played every evening, Daniel explained. Said it helped him think. Sometimes I'd drive up here just to listen from the porch. He was quite good. The conservatory was heartbreaking in its abandonment. Exotic plants that had once thrived under Henry's care now stood as brittle skeletons in ornate planters. But even in death they maintained a strange beauty, their dried forms creating intricate shadows on the glass walls. Dad spent hours in here, Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion. He had a gift with plants, could make anything grow. Mom used to say he had magic fingers. In Henry's study I found the most revealing collection of all. The desk drawers were filled with journals, decades worth of careful observations about everything from weather patterns to bird migrations to the changing seasons on the mountain. But mixed in with these scientific observations were more personal entries, glimpses into the inner life of a man struggling with loneliness and loss. One entry, dated just 3 months before his death, stopped me cold. The car and I took another drive today, down to the valley and back. Sometimes I think we're both just marking time, waiting for something that will never come. But the road still calls, and as long as I can answer, I suppose that's enough. I closed the journal carefully, feeling like I'd read something too private for outside eyes. But Daniel, reading over my shoulder, just nodded sadly. "That's Dad," he said simply, always philosophical, even in his loneliness. As the sun began to set through the study windows, painting the room in shades of gold and amber, I found myself overwhelmed by the scope of Henry Blackwood's life. This wasn't just a house, it was a monument to a man who'd lived fully, loved deeply, and faced his final years with a dignity that humbled me. "I should go," I said finally. "I've imposed on your family's privacy enough for one day." But as I started toward the door, Daniel's voice stopped me. "Marvin," he said, and something in his tone made me turn back. "There's something else I need to tell you about that car. About why Dad would have wanted you to find this place." Daniel's words hung in the air like a promise and a threat all at once. I found myself sinking back into the leather chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of the day's discoveries. Outside, the sun was painting the mountains in shades of purple and gold, and somewhere in this beautiful, lonely house, the ghost of Henry Blackwood seemed to be waiting for answers I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already knew this conversation was going to change everything. Daniel moved to the window, his hands clasped behind his back, in a gesture that reminded me painfully of his father's photograph. Dad didn't just save that address in the GPS randomly. He programmed it there specifically, with instructions that if anything happened to him, whoever bought the car should find their way here. I felt my chest tighten. Instructions? He left a letter with his lawyer. Instructions that the car should go to auction, not to family. Not to a dealer. He wanted it to find someone who needed it, someone who would follow that GPS address out of curiosity rather than obligation. Daniel turned back to me, his eyes holding a weight that seemed far too heavy for someone his age. He believed that certain kinds of people would be drawn to take that journey. People like him. People like him? Lonely people. People who'd lost their anchors in life. People who understood what it meant to have children who saw them as burdens rather than blessings. The words hit me like a physical blow because they were so accurate it hurt. I thought about David's constant suggestions that I downsize, move somewhere more practical. I thought about Lisa's monthly calls that always seemed to center around her financial problems rather than any genuine interest in my well-being. When had I become a problem to be managed rather than a father to be loved? "How could he know that about me?" I whispered. Daniel smiled sadly. "Because it's what happened to him. His daughters, my aunts, spent the last 10 years of his life trying to convince him to sell this place and move into assisted living. They said it wasn't safe for him to live alone, said the house was too big, too isolated. What they really meant was that it was inconvenient for them to pretend to care about him when he lived so far away." I recognized the pattern, the subtle cruelty disguised as concern. How many times had David suggested I look into communities for active seniors? How many times had Lisa mentioned that my house was too big for one person, that I should think about liquidating my assets while I was still mentally competent? So he lived here alone for 15 years, mostly. I visited when I could, but I was building my own life, my own career. I thought there would be more time. Daniel's voice cracked slightly. "There's always supposed to be more time." We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, two men separated by 30 years but united by the universal experience of loss and regret. Outside, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and the house around us seemed to breathe with the quiet contentment of a place that had witnessed decades of such evenings. "Can I ask you something personal?" Daniel said finally. I nodded, though I wasn't sure I was ready for more revelations. "What made you buy the car? What made you follow the GPS here instead of just ignoring it?" It was a question I'd been asking myself since the moment I'd raised my hand at the auction. I've been asking myself the same thing all day. 3 years ago, my wife died. Since then, my children have been treating me like I'm some kind of problem to be solved. I wake up every morning in a house that feels like a museum, eat breakfast alone, watch television alone, go to bed alone. When I saw that car, it represented something I've never had, something impractical, something beautiful, something just for me. And the GPS? I thought about it for a moment. Curiosity, I suppose. But more than that, when you're as lonely as I've been, any mystery starts to look like hope. Daniel nodded, as if my answer confirmed something he'd already suspected. Dad wrote about that in his journals. He said loneliness makes you brave in unexpected ways, because you reach a point where any change seems better than the status quo. He was right about that. "There's something else," Daniel said, and I could tell he was building up to something significant, something I haven't told you about why Dad really wanted the car's new owner to find this place. My hands gripped the arms of the leather chair. What? He left specific instructions in his will. If someone followed the GPS to this house, if they showed respect for his memory and his belongings, if they proved themselves to be the kind of person he hoped they'd be. Daniel paused, seeming to gather courage. He wanted them to have the house. The words didn't register at first. I heard them, but they seemed to bounce off my consciousness like stones skipping across water. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" "Dad left provisions in his will for this exact scenario. If the right person bought the car and found their way here, he wanted them to have Blackwood Manor." I stood up so quickly that the chair rocked back on its legs. "That's impossible. You can't just give a house to a stranger." "You're not a stranger," Daniel said calmly. "You're exactly the person Dad hoped would find this place. A man who's lived a good life, who understands loss, who appreciates beauty and respects the past. Someone who wouldn't see this house as an asset to be liquidated, but as a sanctuary to be preserved." I began pacing the room, my mind reeling. This is insane. I'm nobody. I'm a retired factory worker from Maryland who makes poor financial decisions and has children who can't wait for me to die so they can inherit my modest savings account. "Dad was nobody special either," Daniel said quietly. "He was an accountant who inherited this house from his great-uncle and spent 40 years making it into something beautiful. He wasn't rich or famous or important. He was just a man who understood that some places are meant to be homes, not investments." I stopped pacing and stared out the window at the darkening mountains. In the distance I could see lights from Daniel's house, a warm glow that spoke of evening routines and quiet contentment. "This is crazy," I said. But even as I spoke the words, I felt something shifting inside me, some possibility I'd never dared to imagine. "Is it?" Daniel asked. "Is it any crazier than spending your last good years in a house that holds nothing but memories of loss? Is it any crazier than letting your children dictate your choices because you're afraid of being alone?" I thought about my house in Maryland, with its empty rooms and echoing silence. I thought about Margaret's clothes still hanging in the closet because I couldn't bear to pack them away. I thought about the frozen dinners I ate while watching game shows I didn't enjoy, the phone calls that never came, the birthdays my children forgot until a week later. "I couldn't accept something like this," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. "Why not?" "Because I haven't earned it. Because I'm not worthy of it. Because things like this don't happen to people like me." Daniel stood and walked over to where I was standing by the window. Dad would have disagreed. He believed that worthy people were the ones who understood the value of what they were being given. "You've spent the entire afternoon here treating this house and Dad's memory with respect. You haven't touched anything that wasn't offered, haven't assumed any rights or privileges. You've been a guest in the truest sense of the word." In the reflection in the window, I could see both of us standing there, a young man offering hope and an old man afraid to accept it. Behind us, Henry Blackwood's library stretched into shadows, thousands of books holding the accumulated wisdom of centuries, all of it waiting for someone to bring it back to life. "There would be conditions," Daniel continued. "Legal formalities, paperwork to be filed, and I'd want to maintain the small house down the mountain, visit regularly. This place holds too many memories for me to cut ties completely. Of course, I said, though I still couldn't quite believe we were having this conversation. But the house would be yours, truly yours. No rent, no mortgage, no children telling you what to do with it, just a place where you could live out your years in peace, surrounded by beauty and dignity. I pressed my forehead against the cool glass of the window, feeling tears I hadn't shed since Margaret's funeral burning behind my eyes. Outside, the night was settling over the mountains like a blanket, and somewhere in that darkness, my old life waited for me to return to it. But standing here in this magnificent house, surrounded by the carefully preserved dreams of a man I'd never met, but somehow understood completely, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. I felt like I might finally be coming home. I couldn't sleep that night. Daniel had insisted I stay in one of the guest rooms rather than attempt the 3-hour drive back to Maryland in the dark, and I'd gratefully accepted. But as I lay in a 4-poster bed that probably cost more than my yearly pension, staring at a ceiling painted with intricate Victorian moldings, my mind churned with possibilities I'd never dared to imagine. The guest room was larger than my entire living room back home. Through tall windows draped in heavy velvet, moonlight streamed across Persian rugs and antique furniture that belonged in a museum. Everything spoke of a life lived with intention, with appreciation for beauty and craftsmanship. It was so far removed from my world of aluminum siding and vinyl floors that I felt like an imposter even lying there. But Daniel's words kept echoing in my mind. You're exactly the person Dad hoped would find this place. How could a stranger, a dead man I'd never met, have understood my deepest needs better than my own children? How could he have known that I was drowning in a life that had become too small, too empty, too predictable? I got up around 3 in the morning and wandered through the house by moonlight. Without Daniel there to guide me, I felt like I was exploring an enchanted castle from a fairy tale. Each room held new wonders. A bathroom with a clawfoot tub and stained glass windows, a breakfast nook with built-in benches and windows that would overlook the mountains at sunrise, a butler's pantry with glass front cabinets filled with china that hadn't been used in years. In the kitchen, I found evidence of Henry Blackwood's final months. The refrigerator was still stocked with simple foods: bread, milk, eggs, the basics of a man who'd learned to take care of himself. On the counter, a coffee maker sat beside a single mug, worn smooth by years of morning rituals. Somehow, that lonely mug broke my heart more than all the grandeur of the rest of the house. I made myself coffee with Henry's supplies using his mug, and sat at the kitchen table as the first hints of dawn began to lighten the sky. Through the window, I could see the mountains emerging from darkness like sleeping giants awakening to another day. The silence was so complete it felt sacred, broken only by the gentle tick of an antique clock somewhere in the house. This was what peace felt like. This was what home could be. By the time Daniel arrived at 8 o'clock that morning, I'd made my decision. I met him at the front door, still wearing yesterday's clothes, probably looking like I'd aged a decade overnight. "You look like you've been thinking," he said, a knowing smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I have," I said, "all night." We walked through the house together in the morning light, and everything looked different than it had the evening before. Where I'd seen overwhelming grandeur, I now saw potential. The library could be my sanctuary, a place to read and think, and maybe even write. The music room could come alive again if I remembered enough piano from childhood lessons. The conservatory could bloom with new plants, new life. "There's something I need to know," I said as we stood in the dining room, sunlight streaming through tall windows onto a table that could seat 12. "Why aren't you keeping this place? You're young. You could make a life here." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, running his hand along the polished surface of the dining table. "Because it's not my dream," he said finally. "This was Dad's sanctuary, his refuge from a world that didn't understand him. I have my own life to build, my own dreams to pursue. But I couldn't bear to see this place turned into a bed and breakfast or divided up for development. Dad poured his soul into every room, and it deserves to be loved by someone who understands what it represents." "And you think I'm that person?" "I know you are. The way you looked at his books last night, the reverence you showed for his belongings, the fact that you drove 3 hours based on nothing but curiosity and hope. Dad would have recognized a kindred spirit immediately." We spent the morning going through the practical details. Daniel showed me where the utilities were controlled, how the heating system worked, which rooms had been updated over the years and which retained their original Victorian charm. The house was in remarkable condition for its age, a testament to Henry's careful stewardship and Daniel's recent maintenance. "There's no mortgage," Daniel explained as we stood in Henry's study, surrounded by decades of carefully kept financial records. "Dad paid it off 20 years ago. The property taxes are about $6,000 a year. Utilities run maybe $4,000 depending on the season. Very manageable on a pension. $10,000 a year to live in paradise." Back home, I was paying almost that much just for property taxes on a house I didn't even like anymore. "What about your aunts?" I asked. "Won't they challenge this?" Daniel's expression darkened slightly. "They might try. But Dad was very specific in his will, and he was completely competent when he wrote it. His lawyer assured me that the provisions for the car and the house are ironclad. Besides, they made it clear they wanted nothing to do with this place. You can't abandon something and then complain when someone else claims it. By noon, I knew I was going to say yes. The question wasn't whether I wanted this incredible gift, but whether I had the courage to accept it. At 67, was I too old to start over? Was I too set in my ways to adapt to a new life in a new place? "There's one condition," I said finally, and Daniel looked at me with raised eyebrows. "What's that?" "The car. I want to give it back to you. It brought me here, but it belongs with your family. It should stay with someone who knew and loved your father." Daniel's eyes filled with tears. He quickly blinked away. "You don't have to do that." "Yes, I do. That car was your father's most precious possession. It deserves to be cherished by someone who understands its true value, not by an old man who bought it on impulse. Dad would have wanted you to keep it. Your father was generous enough to give me a new life. The least I can do is give you back the piece of his memory that means the most." We shook hands on it there in Henry's study, surrounded by his books and his journals and the accumulated wisdom of a life well lived. Daniel would handle the legal paperwork, transfer the deed, take care of all the details that would make this incredible dream a reality. That afternoon, as Daniel drove me back to Maryland to collect my things and handle my own arrangements, I called my children from the passenger seat of his pickup truck. I'd been dreading this conversation all day, but I knew it had to be done. David answered on the second ring. "Dad, is everything okay? You never call on weekdays." "I'm fine," I said, watching the Virginia countryside roll past the window. "Better than fine, actually. I'm calling to let you know I'm moving." "Moving? Where? Please tell me you're finally looking at those senior communities I sent you information about." "Not exactly. I'm moving to Virginia, to a house in the mountains." There was a long pause. "Dad, you can't be serious. You don't know anyone in Virginia. How did you even find a house there?" I explained about the car, about the GPS, about Henry Blackwood and Daniel, and the incredible gift I'd been offered. With each detail, David's voice grew more strained, more concerned. "This sounds like a scam, Dad. People don't just give away mansions to strangers. You need to think about this rationally." "I've been thinking rationally for 67 years, I said, surprised by the firmness in my own voice. "Maybe it's time I tried something else." The conversation with Lisa went even worse. She was convinced I was having some kind of mental breakdown, that I was being taken advantage of by unscrupulous strangers. Both of my children begged me to slow down, to think things through, to consider the practical implications of such a drastic change. But as I listened to their objections, their fears, their assumption that I was too old and too foolish to make my own decisions, I realized something important. Their concerns weren't really about my well-being. They were about their inheritance, about maintaining control, about keeping me safely contained in a life they could understand and manage. For the first time in 3 years, I didn't care what they thought. That evening, as Daniel and I sat on Henry's front porch watching the sun set over the mountains, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret died. I felt like I was exactly where I was supposed to be. "Are you sure about this?" Daniel asked, echoing his father's thoughtful nature. I looked out at the mountains turning purple in the twilight, at the house behind us with its promise of books to read and music to play, and gardens to tend. Somewhere in the darkness, night birds were beginning their evening songs, and the air smelled of pine and possibility. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," I said, and meant every word. 6 months later, I woke up in my own bed in my own house, surrounded by mountains that had become as familiar as old friends. The morning light streaming through the tall windows of what had once been Henry Blackwood's bedroom fell across furniture I'd chosen myself, books I'd arranged according to my own system, and photographs of Margaret that finally looked at home in their new surroundings. The transition hadn't been easy. Moving a lifetime's worth of possessions from Maryland to Virginia had taken 3 weeks and more trips than I cared to count. Sorting through 42 years of marriage, deciding what to keep and what to let go, had been one of the most emotionally exhausting experiences of my life. But with each box I unpacked in my new home, I felt a little more like the man I was meant to be. David and Lisa had come around eventually. David had visited twice, both times expecting to find me living in squalor or being taken advantage of by mountain con artists. Instead, he'd found me healthier and happier than I'd been since before Margaret's illness. The last time he called, he'd actually asked for my advice about a decision he was making at work, treating me like a father rather than a problem to be managed. Lisa had been harder to convince, but when she'd finally made the trip to see my new home, she'd stood in the library for 20 minutes without saying a word, just staring at the thousands of books and the leather chairs positioned perfectly to catch the afternoon light. "Dad," she'd said finally, "this is incredible. You actually did it. You actually found your place." The house had come alive under my care. I'd hired local craftsmen to repair the sagging porch and replace the missing shingles. The conservatory now bloomed with plants I'd chosen and nurtured myself, everything from orchids to herbs I used in the simple meals I prepared in Henry's kitchen. The music room echoed with sounds again, not just the piano I'd remembered how to play, but sometimes Daniel's guitar when he came for our weekly dinners. Daniel had become more than a friend. He'd become the son I'd never really had. Our relationship was built on choice rather than obligation, on genuine affection rather than duty. He helped me navigate the complexities of mountain living. Which contractor to trust, where to shop for supplies, how to prepare for the harsh winters that were so different from Maryland's mild seasons. But more than that, he'd helped me understand Henry's legacy. Through Daniel's stories and Henry's journals, I'd come to know the man whose sanctuary I now shared. Henry had been a dreamer who'd found the courage to live his dreams, a man who'd understood that happiness wasn't about impressing others, but about creating a life that felt authentic and meaningful. I'd started keeping my own journal, continuing a tradition that went back more than a century in this house. My entries were simpler than Henry's philosophical observations, mostly records of daily life, the first daffodils blooming in March, the family of deer that grazed in the meadow beyond the house, the quiet satisfaction of reading by the fire on cold evenings. But occasionally I found myself writing about deeper things. About the courage it had taken to accept Daniel's offer. About the peace that came from living in a place that felt like home rather than just shelter. About the unexpected joy of discovering that it was never too late to become the person you were meant to be. The car situation had resolved itself in a way that felt perfectly right. Daniel had accepted the Cadillac back, but only on the condition that I keep it during the week for trips to town and errands. On weekends, he'd drive up the mountain in his father's car, and we'd take long rides through the countryside, following the same routes Henry had loved. Those drives had become sacred time for both of us. Daniel would tell me stories about his father's adventures, and I'd share memories of Margaret and the dreams we'd deferred for too many practical tomorrows. Sometimes we'd drive in comfortable silence, just enjoying the scenery and the powerful purr of the Cadillac's engine. On one particular Sunday in October, as we drove through valleys painted in autumn colors that took my breath away, Daniel asked me a question that surprised me. "Do you ever regret it? Leaving your old life behind?" I thought about it as we wound through mountains that blazed with red and gold. I thought about my old house, which had sold quickly to a young family who would fill it with laughter and new memories. I thought about my neighbors, most of whom I'd barely known despite living next door to them for decades. I thought about the routine that had defined my days. Breakfast alone, television alone, dinner alone, sleep alone. Never, I said, and realized I meant it completely. That wasn't really living. It was just waiting to die. And now, I gestured toward the mountains rising around us, toward the home that waited for us at the end of our drive. Now I'm living the life Henry Blackwood dreamed of, but never quite achieved. I'm surrounded by beauty. I have meaningful work to do, and I have a family that chose me rather than being stuck with me. Daniel smiled, his hand steady on the steering wheel of his father's beloved car. Dad would be so happy to know his plan worked. That evening, As we sat on the front porch sharing a bottle of wine and watching the stars emerge in the clear mountain sky, I found myself thinking about the chain of events that had brought me here. A lonely old man's death, an impulsive purchase at an auction, a GPS programmed with hope rather than just coordinates, and a young man generous enough to honor his father's final wishes. It seemed impossible that so much happiness could have grown from such a simple beginning. But maybe that was the point. Maybe the best changes in life came not from grand plans and careful strategies, but from the courage to follow curiosity wherever it led. A year after moving to Blackwood Manor, I received a letter that nearly brought me to tears. It was from a woman named Elizabeth who'd bought Margaret's china at an estate sale. She'd tracked me down through the real estate agent to tell me that she'd looked up the pattern online and discovered it was quite valuable, probably worth several $1,000s. But that wasn't why she'd written. She'd written to tell me that she was a young widow with 2 small children, and that using Margaret's beautiful china for their daily meals had brought an unexpected elegance to their simple lives. Her children had learned to treat the dishes with respect, and family dinners had become occasions worth celebrating, rather than just obligations to be endured. "I wanted you to know," she'd written, "that your wife's treasures are being loved and appreciated. They're creating new memories while honoring the old ones." I'd sat in Henry's library reading that letter over and over again, understanding for the first time that letting go of the past didn't mean abandoning it. It meant allowing it to transform into something new and beautiful, just as my own life had been transformed by a dead stranger's generosity. That night, I called Daniel to share Elizabeth's letter with him. When I finished reading it aloud, there was a long pause before he spoke. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's exactly what Dad hoped would happen with this place. He wanted his legacy to create new happiness, not just preserve old memories." As spring returned to the mountains for the second time since I'd arrived, I found myself thinking about legacy and love and the unexpected ways that strangers could become family. Henry Blackwood had never met me, but he'd understood me well enough to design a gift that would change my life completely. Daniel had honored his father's wishes despite having every legal right to ignore them. Elizabeth was treating Margaret's china with the same reverence Margaret herself had shown it. We were all connected, all part of some larger story about how love and kindness could ripple forward through time, touching lives in ways we might never fully understand. I was 70 years old now, and I'd finally learned the most important lesson of my life. Home wasn't a place you were born into or inherited or bought with careful saving. Home was a place that recognized you the moment you arrived, a place that had been waiting for you all along. Standing on my front porch that morning, coffee mug in hand, watching the sun rise over mountains that had become my sanctuary, I understood what Henry Blackwood had tried to tell me through his carefully programmed GPS and his son's generous heart. Sometimes the best journeys were the ones you never planned to take. Sometimes the greatest gifts came from people you'd never met. And sometimes, if you were very lucky and very brave, you could find your way home at an age when most people thought the journey was over. I was home, finally, completely, gloriously home.